All right, recording.
Okay. Perfect. Welcome, everyone, and thanks for being here. I'm Chris Spinelli, Vice President of the Florida Council for the Social Studies, and this afternoon I'm joined by Dr. Scott Waring, Professor of Social Science Education at the University of Central Florida, and this afternoon's presenter, Dr. Kenny Anthony, Associate Professor of Education at Mississippi State University. I want to thank both of them for being here. I'd like to give a special thank you to the University of Central Florida Teaching with Primary Sources program, as well as the College of Community Innovation and Education for providing a grant in part for this webinar series. This afternoon, Dr. Anthony will provide an overview of the sources framework for teaching with primary and secondary sources and lead you through a sources scaffolded investigation into how historians use primary sources to understand and write narratives about the past, but focusing on how to develop students' critical thinking skills and increase their knowledge of the Reconstruction era. So with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Waring. Dr. Waring, if you have anything you'd like to say.
Hey, thanks, Chris. And for all of those who are joining and who know me, you can call me Scott if anybody wants to interact during the presentation here. Feel free to use the chat. And I think, Kenny, you okay with people interrupting? Okay. All right, so I am Scott Waring. I'm a professor at the University of Central Florida. I do run the Teaching with Primary Sources program at the University of Central Florida and the Sources Conference and several other things. And I have to say specifically with this webinar series, I'm extremely thankful for Dr. Karen Baraima because she heads up the Brinson Foundation grant and allowed me to write a proposal and fund it to help us to create this webinar series. So hopefully you'll enjoy it today. I'm thrilled to be able to present our presenter for the day today. So Dr. Kenny Anthony from Mississippi State University, who is also one of my colleagues in the TPS program from the Library of Congress. So he does some phenomenal work there in Mississippi and has been gracious in joining us today. So I'll go ahead and turn it on over to you, Kenny. Oh, you're muted.
I'm gonna share my screen. You can all see my screen now, I hope. So there's my title, the Reconstructing the Story of Reconstruction using the Sources Framework. I'm actually only going to use one source as my base source, and you'll see that, but then we're going to do a lot of corroborating and contextualizing in just a minute. I'm just submitting people also as I go through. I guess that's okay. So here we go. So TPS Mississippi. One more, just a second. With TPS Mississippi is Dr. Paul Benford, Dr. Nicole Miller, and I collaborate on this grant here at Mississippi State, and we make a lot of lesson plans. We do a lot of presenting, and we also do some professional development in schools and school districts and here on campus. And also, when we can, we try to get down to the Central Florida to visit with Scott. And I'm not going to click a whole bunch on this, but I just let you see that we do have some some lesson plans. We got some websites. I did and Scott and I both put a link to this Weebly there, so you can go check that out. We have some lesson plans K through 12 that are aligned to that incorporate primary sources from the Library of Congress. These lesson plans were actually taught by teachers before they were posted, so we worked with them to write the lesson plans. They taught them in the lessons. We made revisions, and then they posted them. So they've actually all been taught somewhere in the K through 12 or third grade through 12 classroom. Another thing we have is our teaching primary sources Mississippi cognitive task. We took a look at what the research says about what tasks it takes to analyze and work with primary sources, and we kind of did one of those introduction, practice, mastery by grade for each one of those tasks, and so we'd encourage you to check that out. And then we do a lot of PD. In the summer, we have 3 PDs going on, and the links will be there. So, but we'll go on. I'm not going to spend much time on that because we want to talk about the sources framework. Scott, I think you're going to talk about the sources framework, correct?
Yes, I'm back. So I'm going to just take control real quickly, if you don't mind, and we can turn it back to you in a minute. So I'm going to share screen just so everybody can see this. Look good? All right, cool. So before I get rolling, I do want to thank everybody who's here live or joins in the video later. I do appreciate teachers and I love what you do. So keep doing what you're doing. And I think especially since you're here today or viewing this later, that means you care and you're making effort. So thank you. I do appreciate it. And I think all of us, I think I can speak for all of us. So I put on here teachingwithsources.weebly.com, which is the address you saw in the chat. This is a page where I put together some resources, but it also, you see the Reconstruction link there at the top is Kenny's presentation. So you can go directly through his link, or in case you accidentally somewhere get to the home page and you're wondering where is it, it's under the Reconstruction link. But let me tell you a little bit about the sources framework. So I've been creating the sources framework for about 25 years now. And last year I started working more with Kenny and some of his teachers and introduced them to it. So they've been using it in a multitude of ways there in Mississippi. So one of the examples you're going to see today is using the sources framework to teach some of the content around Reconstruction-America. But I know some of you are familiar, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I want to make sure Kenny's got enough time too. But the sources framework in a nutshell is me trying to create a framework that allows students to think creatively, critically, historically, but not in a way that many times we do in the classroom where we throw a bunch of sources at them, maybe 15 sources, and ask them to write a thesis paper. For me, that doesn't work. I've seen a lot of failure in the classrooms, and I think some research would indicate as well that that may not be the most effective way to approaching teaching with primary sources. So besides the framework, I also must say that I do have stages that I lead up to introducing them to primary sources. What are they? How do you engage with them? How do you properly analyze them? So imagine that they've moved to the stage where they can engage in disciplined inquiry, or in this case, historical inquiry. So what do I ask them to do? In the first stage is scrutinizing a fundamental source. I would argue that you need to find one source that you consider absolutely fundamental to whatever topic you're teaching. So with that source, that's how you introduce them to this topic. Second source is understanding your thoughts. So the student should stop and think, well, what do I understand now? What do I think about this source around the context, the content around that particular source? It may be minimal, it may be nothing. That's absolutely fine, but they should come to grips with what they understand and help share that with you so you can prepare the rest of the investigation. Stage 3 is understanding the context. Now, what I argue here is you may need to start filling in gaps so that they can be successful in later stages of the investigation. So how do you fill in the gaps? How do you make them understand the context of it? You can do that in a lot of different ways. Sometimes I find chapters within books or children's literature to be just the key thing that will help them to understand the context around whatever topic you're teaching. You could also use other primary sources or secondary sources at this stage, but whenever possible, I just love children's literature. So I try to use that for filling the gaps so that they can really build the contextual understanding. In the next stage, read between the lines. At this point in time, once we've built some of that context, I ask them to go back to the initial fundamental source. So let's pretend it's a letter. So they read that earlier, they didn't fully grasp, but maybe now they've got some more contextual understanding, they can revisit that letter and then understand it with a different lens. And I think seeing that transformation is really cool within the students. And we're still only dealing with one source, maybe two. Sometimes I'll see, and I've used where you have maybe an image with some text source, so you may pair two, but I would argue let's not start with 15 or 20 sources when we engage our students. Next is corroborate and refute. So that's the stage where students start really thinking critically about an essential question that would guide this investigation. Now, this is where they get an opportunity to start thinking about how they would construct their own narrative. That's something that I didn't get to do in my own K-12, and many don't, but they need to understand how that narrative around the content is created. And that's through corroborating their understandings, but then also I think refuting is really important, because a lot of times we forget to try to find sources that may not mesh exactly with what we're thinking and saying, or the narrative that's being constructed in our heads. And I think that's an important stage as well. By this time, hopefully they're able to start thinking about how that narrative is constructed. They're probably working through that immensely, maybe, using some emerging technologies to jot down ideas, start creating that narrative. So then we're ready to establish that plausible narrative. That's another thing that I argue, is that so often I was taught that there was a truth with a capital T. So I like using the terms plausible narrative, so they have evidence-based narratives that is the most plausible or probable account of what happened. And so when I say the term narrative, I also mean that can be done in many different ways. I've seen some creative ways with political cartoons. If you joined us last week, Dr. Brian Fergione does some really great stuff with political cartoons, things like historical markers, documentaries, other things. Or if you want to utilize a more traditional, written narrative essay, you definitely could, but I would say try to vary it whenever possible. And then in the last stage is summarizing final thoughts. In that stage, I argue that the students need to think about what they've learned, but then also the process in which they learn. So that metacognitive opportunity to think about their thinking. So what did I learn? How did I learn it? What worked well? What didn't work well? How may I modify or tweak in the future? So that's a really quick run through. So if you go to my site later, you'll be able to see some of the resources with my analysis sheet and the framework analysis sheet there, and then some of the articles and books that I published around the sources framework. So please go to the About Me. You'll see a little bio on me, but then a link to my email. So if you don't have my book yet, please email me. If you care to have a copy, I'll send it out to you for free. I'll get that out to you in a couple of weeks after you email me. If you need any of these other chapters or articles, please let me know and I'll make sure you get an electronic version of it. So that's a quick overview of the sources framework. So I'm going to turn it back over to Kenny, and he's going to walk you through an investigation. And give me 1 second here, Kenny. Sorry, I need to give you sharing back. Oh, did you get it? Perfect.
Thank you, Scott. And you're going to see some of what Scott has as far as the framework just saying. So get ready. We're going to focus on one primary source, like Scott said. I love to use one really rich source, and I think we've got one today. And then use other sources to corroborate, contextualize, and as we'll see as we go through the sources framework. If you have another device, I do. Sometimes it might be good to have that other device to be able to look at the particular source as you go, as we go through it if you want to, so you don't have to go back and forth, but you don't have to. And then, of course, ask questions in the chat. I'll make sure I'm looking at the chat. I'm going to move it so I can see it. And then I'll try to answer questions in the chat. And I also don't care if you just blurt out, okay? And anyway, so I'll try to respond to the questions in the chat, but I won't type them. So get ready. So we're going to introduce our source. So this is our source. And we're going to look at it at length in a minute, but if you have another device like your phone or iPad, just use the QR code and we'll cross our fingers that it's going to work. I just tried it a minute ago and it worked on my iPad. So this is the source we're going to use. It's Slavery is Dead. And we'll talk about, when it was made and who made it in just a minute. So I'll wait just about 30 seconds if you want to try to open another window using a hyperlink or use another device, just a little bit longer. Yes, Mark, we can definitely consider multiple perspectives because I'm going to annotate this. You'll see that I'm going to bring in some other primary sources and some secondary sources because I think primary sources are important, but oftentimes primary sources sometimes can be misleading. And I did deliberately choose one that's pretty factual here, and you'll see. But yeah, so all right. But that's a great question about that because we do want to corroborate. I think it was somebody just said that, asked that question. So, all right. So we'll go into the next thing. So initial thoughts on the source. And I just got some questions. And in a lot of ways, if I was teaching this, I would do a see, think, wonder type of thing. But as you're looking at the source and hopefully you're able to, I'm going to go back to it, but, just think about what things do you see? What stands out to you? What questions do you have? How does this image make you feel? And the technical difficulties thing, you got to just try again. Yeah, the Uncle Sam, the slave owner looks like both Uncle Sam and Jeff Davis. Great, Stephen. It's interesting. My students often say that it looks like Uncle Sam. And while we're doing this, I'm going to switch the share to the actual image. How is that right there? So I'll go to that actual image so we can all look at it. And so, it looks like Uncle Sam, but it actually isn't. But a lot of people say it looks like him. What else? What other thoughts you have? What stands out to you? And can y'all see the, I don't think I just didn't share go back to the screen. Scott, can you see the actual Slavery is Dead cartoon?
Yeah, your thing link is showing just fine.
Okay, good deal. All right, thank you. All right, just want to make sure I can see it. So we got the question marks. Yeah, we see these question marks up here. And a couple more things. Some other people jump in. What do you see? How does it make you feel? What questions do you have? I always like to, before I get into a formal investigation, I like to look at, Scott says violence. There's definitely significant violence going on in this. Yeah, Stephen asks, is it Thomas Nast? We see that TH Nast, and definitely I'll go ahead and tell you, it's Thomas Nast. We're already into kind of some sourcing. We're trying to figure out, well, who made this? Okay. Other thoughts that you might have. We got the question marks around the title. We got these violent acts that are going on. States' rights equals death. Yeah, I always call this the Voldemort thing, down here at the bottom. All right. It almost feels apocalyptic. The writing font is interesting. Oh, yeah. It definitely has this feeling of foreboding. Blindfold on the right. Yeah. And the question is justice supposed to be blind? And is it some type of double meaning? Because a lot of times justice is shown blind, but is he blind to the injustice? I don't know. There's a lot of questions we don't know there. One more person put something in there about what they see or how they feel when they look at this particular source. Any other thoughts? Let's see. All right, well, we'll get right into it then. If we'll go back to the presentation. And we'll come back to that. And I think somebody said that when they went to the Library of Congress, the link, you get an awful lot of those. We're having technical difficulties with the 1930s truck flat tire thing. And that's just pretty normal for them. Just hit refresh a couple of times and it'll pop up. So we're not going to do the See, Think, Wonder, but one thing you could do is you could do an actual See, Think, Wonder with this. Yeah, it's printed in 1867. Thanks, Robert. Because we, and again, we're sourcing that, and also a little bit of contextualization. Isn't it a large picture by Nast with the central figure of the liberated freed people in the middle of the slave? Yep. There's definitely, Nast had tons of Reconstruction things, cartoons, Mark, that illustrated a lot of the hypocrisy of Reconstruction. And I mean, he really beat up President Johnson, and he also beat up the Southern slaveholding, then later plantation class of people, as well as Republicans who were not radical Republicans. But there is a lot of that. And so this may not be taken from this, but this is, Mark, this is in the same type of document. But I would do a See, Think, Wonder with this. There's really no reason to do this with you because I want to hop right into the sources. But if I was teaching this, I might do a See, Think, Wonder to really get the juices flowing on this. But since we're not going to do the See, Think, Wonder, I had some students do a See, Think, Wonder on this. And these are the things that they came up with. So you can see, they see both white and African-American men. One white man beating an African-American man. You see that on the right side in the right panel. I see other men just standing about. And some of them even look like they're enjoying what they're seeing. One appears to be reading and others appear to be talking. So over here, we've got somebody, it looks like, the auction or the sale. The first wonder question is interesting. Yep. It makes me wonder when slavery really did end. Great, Stephen. It definitely is a big question. And when we contextualize this, we'll see that Thomas Nast is asking the right question. And see, I see the word slavery is dead, and they talk about the question mark. They see Emancipation Proclamation. They see 1863. They see land of the free, home of the brave. All right. Of course, there's some irony there, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, that land of the free is below this panel where someone's being sold, and home of the brave is below the panel of an act that I don't think could be described as brave, beating a man who is bound or at least has no ability to defend himself, or at least in this instant doesn't have the ability to defend himself. They notice the different designs and symbols. You've got an auction gavel here. You've got a whip here. And then you got these typical American symbols of justice and liberty, liberty on the left and justice on the right. Got the skeleton they pointed out, the states' rights skeleton. And again, on this side, he's at auction, the gavel on the right side, he has the whip. And then when I see this, I think it's slavery really dead. I see the question marks. Are these two images from different times? And remember that because it's going to come up in a minute. This political cartoon makes me feel that while African Americans were free from slavery, they're not treated the same as other citizens. And that comes to, they're already getting to the crux of what Reconstruction is all about. I think NAS might be trying to convey a message relating to the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 or Civil Rights Act of 1866. All right. So they definitely understand NAS has got a message, and that's going to be important later. The specters do not seem to be disturbed, of course, or by the selling or the punishment. And then the wonder, when did slavery really end? Why the switch from liberty to justice in the statutes? And of course, the teaching is, it makes sense to have liberty here because this person's liberty is being taken away. And this justice here, this person is not receiving justice. Of course, according to NAST, and I think we'd all agree with him. How much emphasis NAST is placed on states' rights. And a lot of times in places like Mississippi, I don't know about in Florida, growing up, the concept that, people would say something like, well, the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights, as if states' rights was this neutral term. But according to Thomas Nast, it's a very loaded, it is a negative term because it was the states' rights to do what? Possess slaves, to hold human beings as property and to sell them as they want to. And in this instance, it's the states' rights to enact, these conditions on the African-American population after slavery has ended, after the Civil War. And then they had some other questions and other wonders. So, but the students who did this asked me for an essential question because I failed them, Scott. And I gave them an essential question to make them, that may not end up being the most important question that we're going to address. But really the question was, what were the conditions of for freedmen in 1866 in the southern states? And that's really what Nast is getting at with this particular cartoon. He's looking at, all right, what it really is going on here. And in these panels, often, if you just look at it for the first time, it's very confusing. You might think that these are two different events. You might think that this was before Emancipation Proclamation, this is after, but you'll see in a minute, these events are happening at the same time. They are contemporary with when this cartoon was created. And so this idea, the question I gave them was, hey, what were the conditions? And then I had the students go through the sources framework, but I limited them just a little bit because I wanted to limit what they had. I didn't want them to go do a whole bunch of digging because I was going to do that digging with you. And so the first step that Scott talks about is scrutinizing the fundamental source. And we have that. Thomas Nast created this illustration, and someone's already brought that up once. When you look here, you see T.H. Nast, that's Thomas Nast. They were to find that out. And then, of course, in 1867, I believe specifically January 12th of 1867, Emancipation Reconstruction could have influenced the source. So they're thinking about it. It most likely did. That's hence the questions. Slavery is dead because it's 1867 after slavery has been abolished by both constitutional amendment and also by the Civil War. It seems dark, but someone's already pointed that out, and that is pointing out a larger problem in their society. And it seems reliable because the primary source created by someone. And oftentimes students get tricked on the reliability of primary sources. Not every primary source is reliable. Sometimes they get it wrong. But in this instance, they don't. And I think we'll see when we do a little bit deeper dive in just a minute with it. The next thing I asked them to organize their thoughts. And so they did this. They said, what they wanted was, they actually are asking for the things that Scott was talking about a minute ago. They want more context to the events of the time. And we're going to give that, and we're going to do that in just a minute. Mark says, I suppose we now say freemen rather than free people rather than free men. I noticed, using free people. Same thing with whether or not we're talking about African-American, Black in different words. So exactly. And then the question is, which terms do you use? You use in terms of the historical time or the present? And historians disagree on that one. You got more, they wanted more context. They want more information on these specific people. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. They said, we wish we had the Emancipation Proclamation and Civil Rights Act that is cited. We talk about the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil Rights Bill that's talked about. They wish they had more access to the reports of the events. These down here, and what I found often with these primary sources, our students get sucked into the images, especially one that has such rich imagery as this, that they tend to ignore the text. And we're going to look at this text in just a minute up close, because the answer to what's going on is really in the text. And then we also need to know more about Nast's background, and we'll look at that. And that goes into sourcing about why he was so passionate And then of course, we got the sources framework, understand the context. And they very quickly understood that this image was created a few years after the American Civil War. Okay, really about a year and a half after the Civil War, as Reconstruction began. And it is in the middle of the start of Reconstruction. It's at that transition time from presidential Reconstruction to radical Reconstruction. And then they acknowledged the sources published in Harper's Weekly, which was based in New York. And then when you start thinking about who the audience is, obviously, the residents of Vicksburg, Mississippi, are not the audience of Harper's Weekly. They probably would burn it, but they would not use it. There's a different audience. NAS audience are people who believe that the freed people, the freedmen, these former slaves who now are citizens, should have the right, of citizens. And he's pointing it out to people who might agree with him, and also calling into question the hypocrisy of some of our elected officials. Now, we also talk about context. Scott brought up some really interesting, talking about some sources, and we'll come back to these in a little bit, but two really good resources is one of them is the amazing age of John Roy Lynch. He was the first elected official from Mississippi to go to Congress. That was an African-American. He was born in slavery. He became self-educated, and he was well-respected. One of the success stories of Reconstruction. He actually wrote his own memoirs, and they were officially published in 1970. So I'm going to use some of his stuff to contextualize it. But there was a really good book written by him, a children's book, The Amazing Age of John Roy Lynch. It talks about Reconstruction and his life, both. And so that's a good example. And then Dark Sky Rising, Reconstruction and the Dawn of Jim Crow by Henry Louis Gates. So it's a fantastic book also. So I would recommend those books to help your students kind of understand, and that's for all grades, help them understand what's going on the larger thing. And then read between the lines. And I think if this, if Scott's framework or sources framework is as shallow as maybe that the students got, they really understood what was going on. They really read between the lines that, what, we can infer that African Americans still face many prejudice after being freed. And we know this because we're adults, but oftentimes our students don't. I mean, I'll be, I grew up in Mississippi, but I also grew up in an area of Mississippi that did not have a lot of the racial conflict and strife in the 70s and 80s. Desegregation wasn't a huge problem where I grew up. And so we weren't aware of that. I went to school from kindergarten all the way up, and I started kindergarten in 1975 in desegregated schools. So we had no idea, because people cooperated and they kind of hid this from you. Then you get to 9th grade and you get into Mississippi studies and you go, oh my goodness. Or you get into 11th grade and you get the US history, and you start to see it. A lot of times, if you're not from Mississippi or the Deep South and other places, you may not know this. It may sound just like it sounds really good that we integrated schools with Brown versus Board of Education. That didn't happen. That was the 1950s. Mississippi schools didn't fully integrate until 1969, 1970, and other states were the same way. And so sometimes we see Civil War ended slavery, and we talk about the constitutional amendments, but they didn't. That might have been in law, but not in fact. And so this particular source brings that out, and these students were able to get to that. And then they said NASA must have created this to point out the unfair treatment of African Americans, and of course they get to that is actually his goal. So. And then, of course, corroborate or refute. It's hard to refute the harshness of Reconstruction and the way that America failed in Reconstruction in many ways. There were some successes, but ultimately it was a failure. But there are some sources that they found on the Library of Congress that refuted this, that made Reconstruction look like it's more successful. But maybe in 1868, they didn't think it was a failure. We know it's a failure now. In many ways, looking back. And so they found some sources on the Library of Congress that challenged this particular view of it. I have found some other sources that were, contemporary. One of them is Lynch's accounts, as well as a guy named Carl Schurtz's account in 1865, where he goes around and he says, you know what, if we don't do something really quickly, the southern states are just going to create another version of slavery. They're just not going to call it slavery. And so he warns them. And so there's some sources that corroborate these types of behaviors, and we're going to read those in just a minute. And of course, then they go and they established a plausible narrative, and they drew upon their prior knowledge, which is what we would want them to do. And it says, from our prior knowledge in viewing NASA image, we can clearly look back and see the poor treatment of African Americans during the 1860s. This source helps point that out. We have learned that this was a very dividing topic during the time. If I look at other sources, we learned that many people had different views at that time. There were people who saw Reconstruction as relatively successful. Again, we have the hindsight of looking back and seeing that it was a failure in many ways, and that this cartoon that NASA created probably does a good job of showing the resistance in the South and other parts of America to full Reconstruction. So, summarize our final thoughts. This is what they said. And that's going to lead to what we're about to do. He says, we feel we need more sources to fully answer the question, which goes back to, I think it was Mark saying, hey, is one source enough? One source is not enough. We do need more sources just to understand what's going on in this particular cartoon. And they still want to know how life was different for African Americans in other parts of the country. So was this unique, or is this the standard? It's kind of what they're getting at. And we also would like to know how long African Americans were treated this way that NAS presents. And the good news is a lot of this type of stuff ends, but other things take its place. And then what steps we're taking to create more equality. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a little deeper dive into the sources framework. I'm not going to do this linearly. I'm going to do it throughout the source. And so I'll be hitting on each one of the SOURCESs, each one of the steps. And then as we go through this, but I created an annotated thing link. And I don't know if you're familiar with thing link, but I really like thing link. I think thing link is a great tool for teaching how to do different things. So I'm going to share with you this thing link again, hopefully. And Scott or somebody just verify that you can actually see my thing link. Yep. All right. Thank you all. Thank you, Scott and Robert. All right. So what I've done is, and if you're familiar with ThingLink, is it just as a Web 2.0 tool has been around, I think about 8 years now, that allows you to annotate with hyperlinks, with images, with text, a document or a website or anything you want to. And so I uploaded this particular document. And so when I start looking at this ThingLink, we got the two images. This thing really is two images, and these that are representing two events that are going on or that have recently happened. And to understand what those two events are, and what I've noticed is students do poorly with this, and this is these are junior high, high school, and college students. Again, they totally ignore the text. And so I'm going to get to that in just a second. But you've got here on the left, you have a man. Oftentimes my students will say a slave. I'm saying, no, this is a man. This is a human. He's not even an enslaved person anymore, because this is in 1867. He's not enslaved. He's not a slave. He is a free citizen of the United States. And it looks like he's being sold. All right, because we got a gavel here. We got a man with a ledger here. And then we got Liberty, Lady Liberty. And then we got this look from this human being, this citizen of the United States, looking back at her saying, really? What's going on? So we have that going on. And then let's see what actually this is based on. So this is based on an event that actually happened in Annapolis, Maryland. All right. Thank you, Christopher. And so what it says is, again, we're using the terms of the time. At the time, Negro was a polite term to use. So it says Negro sold as a punishment for crime. It says public sale, the undersigned will offer for sale at the courthouse door in the city of Annapolis at 11 o'clock a.m. on Saturday, the 22nd of December, a Negro named Jonathan Johnson, aged about 40 years. The said Negro was convicted at the October term, 1866, of the Circuit Court of Anne Arundel County of larceny and sentenced to be sold. And then the person who said that was William Bryan, the sheriff, has put that out. And then again, is a second event where it says December 24th, 4 Negroes convicted of larceny and offered to be sold by Judge Magruder at Annapolis were sold on Saturday last. And so think about Christmas Eve. And so, what you can do with ThingLink is, if the image isn't good enough, you can also put it here. And the neat thing is, it'll actually play this. If you click here, it'll read it for you. So that's kind of neat too. So this is an actual event in Maryland, a non-Confederate state, by the way, did not secede. Just to remind everyone of this, they did not secede. And so this is what Thomas Nast is depicting here. So it's a real event. In the right side, what we have is we have Lady Justice. And what I think is very interesting, you can't really see it, is that the J in Justice is backwards. And you think about it, a man who carves a wood carving, it's as detailed as was, is that an accident or is he sending a message there? Again, she's blindfolded, which she normally is, but then the scales aren't balanced. So maybe that's the message that she's in. But regardless, where is this man being whipped? Again, this is 1867, no longer an enslaved person, no longer property. This is a free citizen of the United States that is being whipped by a man who looks like either Jefferson Davis or Uncle Sam or whatever. But regardless, but again, oftentimes my students struggle with this because they don't go and they don't look. So we'll look a little bit closer at this. And so the name of this is from a newspaper article. It says Negro sold as a punishment for crime, public sale. The undersigned will offer for sale at the courthouse door in the city of Annapolis. Oh, I put the wrong one. Okay, well, I had the wrong picture, but I had the right text. So here we go. On Monday last, an order issued by General Sickles, that's General Daniel Sickles, who was the Union commander over that area, commanding this department, was handed to Judge Fowle by the order of the military commander here, prohibiting the infliction of corporal punishment. So Daniel Sickles says you can't do the corporal punishment. On Thursday, a telegram from Governor Worth at Washington, which Washington, D.C., was received by the same judge saying that the order was rescinded. You may proceed with the punishment. Sheriff Ray then proceeded to inflict the punishment, and this was in North Carolina, Raleigh, North Carolina, on December 22nd, 1866. So this event, this man is being punished using corporal punishment by this sheriff, all right, by the sheriff, okay? So this is the sheriff. It's not Uncle Sam. It's not Jefferson Davis. It's actually the sheriff. And so what's happening here is Jefferson Davis is actually sending or showing an image, not Jefferson Davis, Thomas Nast actually describing an image of an event that actually happened. And of course, we know it happened in 1867, okay? What I think that's really good, I love history because there's these asides. Daniel Sickles, if you know anything about Daniel Sickles, he was a Union general, but he also was, clicked on the wrong thing. He also was the first person acquitted using the temporary insanity defense. In 1859, his wife was having an affair. He was a congressman. His wife was having an affair in Washington, D.C. He found out about it, and he shot his wife's lover in Lafayette Square there in Washington, D.C., right from the White House in broad daylight in front of witnesses. And the interesting thing was William Stanton, who was the Secretary of War for Lincoln, was his one of his defense attorneys. And the lover that Daniel Sickles shot was Philip Barton Key II, the son of Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star Spangled Banner, which is mentioned here in the Land of the Free, Home of the Brave type of thing. So the history is great because you got all these things. And Sickles lives to, like 1910, or the early 1900s, dies an old, happy, fat man. So a little bit more. So let's look at this and source this. And you got this Thomas Nast guy. And if you don't know about him, man, you can learn a lot more about him. I'll open up one link here. And I don't know if you can see the link, but it just brings to who he was. Political cartoon responsible for a modern understanding or image of Santa Claus, as well as the elephant for the Republicans. That we didn't create the donkey for the Democrats. He updated it. The donkey went all the way back to Jackson. In that time period. And so some great information here, if you can see it, about Thomas Nast, about him. And he was definitely a big Union man and a pro-Lincoln man, and had nothing for, somebody said Tweed and Tammany Hall, great, had nothing for the Confederates and slavery or Reconstruction. So you got a little information. So what we can do with this, we can annotate this and teach our students with this particular source. A little bit more we can look at, the students want to know more about the events. This happens in January of 1867. And so what I did was I went and just create a simple timeline from some sources, so this, and you talk about the Civil Rights Bill in June of 1866. In April 1866, Johnson vetoes the Civil Rights Bill. Congress overrides him. It's the first major legislation that was overridden by Congress, a presidential override, the first major thing. They override it. They realized the Civil Rights Bill had some constitutional issues. So they passed the 14th Amendment, which is passed in 1866, doesn't become law until I believe 1868. It takes those the radical Republicans force all those southern states to ratify it before they can rejoin the Union. And so, but the events here are happening in the fall of 1866 when the Republicans win a large majority in Congress, and a lot of them are radical Republicans. And so it's happening at this time frame. It's post Civil War. It's post 14th Amendment, at least the passage of it is post Civil Rights Amendment. So you have all these things where people have put these things in law that said that these are citizens of the United States. Yes, they were formerly enslaved people and they were slaves, but now they are no longer. It doesn't matter that they used to be. Now they are citizens, but yet we still have these events going on. And so what happens is NASA saying, look, we need more. And then what happens very quickly is in from March of 1867 to about March of 1868, you get what's called radical Reconstruction, where a series of 4 or 5 laws, depending upon which ones you want to include in radical Reconstruction, are passed that ratchets down and puts controls on the South that forces them to get rid of these black codes, because that's really what's going on, forces them to rewrite their constitutions. And for a little while, you have places like Mississippi that has the most liberal constitution in the United States until we rewrite it in the 1890s after Reconstruction ends. And so the 14th Amendment is able to be passed because they ratchet up the Reconstruction into the radical Reconstruction, which you have that conflict between the president and the Congress over that. Of course, Johnson's impeached over several things. Him trying to fire different members of his cabinet, as well as over his relatively soft and benign Reconstruction. Congress ends up passing the 15th Amendment, covers voting. And so you have all these different events, but the Congress makes the ability for these Confederate states to go back in the Union that they pass these amendments. And so what Thomas Nast is doing, he's trying to stop these things. And these are examples of those black codes. And so let's do some corroboration. Do we trust Thomas Nast? Is he a trustworthy person? So we'll go to, here it is, Carl Schurz, 1865 December. He goes and says, indeed, there's an attempt to restore slavery. He goes throughout the Union, or at the Confederacy, the Deep South, and says they're already trying to re-put slavery in some type of system that's not free labor. Okay, they're trying to cheat the system again. And so, this isn't just Thomas Nast's idea. This isn't just one thing. This is a man who traveled through all the southern states, or the Deep South states, and saw this. Or we can talk to John Roy Lynch, where he says that the legislature started passing these laws which virtually re-enslave those who'd been emancipated. And so he's talking about black codes. And so for the North wouldn't stand. And so he's looking back. Lynch is writing this, I believe, in the 1880s. And he's saying that, the North wanted to fix this. And the reason why the North wanted to fix this is because people like Nast are bringing up awareness of it. And so we get these other people. So we don't want to just trust only Nast, and there are other things that we have there. And of course, there was some contextualization type of things. We've already talked about who Thomas Nast was. We sourced it. We know when it was. We know what else was going on. But what was the Civil Rights Bill? Well, the Civil Rights Bill, Republicans passed a bill in response to the notorious black codes, these black codes that are being illustrated here on the panels in this cartoon. And of course, if you want the text of it, you can simply go to the text. The Library of Congress has a link to it. And of course, that's the general text of it. And if you want to know a little bit more about the background of it, it was it was passed over presidential veto. It's nullify the black code. And so you have a little bit of that. And then because they weren't sure if it's constitutional, they said, well, let's just change the Constitution, which led to the 14th Amendment. And so if we want to know what the 14th Amendment is, I think we can find one of those too. Got the Emancipation Proclamation from 1863, the initial one in September 1862, the final one in January of 1863. And so you can get a link to that, a little bit more information about the Emancipation Proclamation if you wanted that information. And then the 14th Amendment. And that basically said all persons born and naturalized in the United States. And so that basically verified what Congress had already passed in 1866, and really should have already been just known based upon the fact that the way that citizenship was granted back then. It should have been a no-brainer, but it wasn't because of the resistance in the South. And so that's how you can kind of use something like this. And of course, we are talking about Daniel Sickle. And then we got the land of the free and home of the brave, got all the symbolism. Of course, you have the link to the Star Spangled Banner, and you get that's the last line. And so one of the great things about these primary sources are you have so many, they're so rich in all these tons of connections that you can make. And that, in a lot of ways, I think that these primary sources are kind of like a pivot. A lot of times social studies social studies about is about content or it's about skills. Well, in a lot of ways, the primary source is a pivot point. You need to do the analysis, but by doing the analysis, you have to rely on content knowledge. But also by doing the analysis, you can increase content knowledge because it forces you to go out and to do that contextualization and that corroboration. So it's an interesting way to look at it. So we'll go back to that. And so I hope you understand kind of how I use that, understand the way that thing was particularly used, that the whole goal of that. So we're back to the sources framework. And what I've done here is I filled out the sources framework based upon what we did on the thing link, based upon what I showed you on thing link. So scrutinize the fundamental source. We know it's Thomas Nast. And then on the far right, this is the evidence on the far right is where we found that, okay? We find that actually on the source, okay? Organize our thoughts. Hey, they want to know about the Civil Rights Bill, Emancipation Proclamation, 14th Amendment. And we were able to do that on the thing link. And so I think by doing the sources early and then coming back to it, we're able to show the students how we're drawing on sources to develop, a fuller thought. And in a minute, I'm gonna get to the narrative. Understand the context. We have that timeline. We got some irony with the Star Spangled Banner. We got those books that we've already talked about. Reading between the lines, man, irony and the symbolism. It's thick, it's rich. And if you understand where it came from, if you understand Home of the Free, Land of the Brave, Home of the Free, if you understand the Lady Liberty and Justice and all that, it makes it deeper. Corroborate and refute. We have two eyewitnesses. We have Lynch's report of black codes, and we have who's the other guy's report? Schertz's report. They're both reporting that there's these problems. And Schertz comes from a wonderful book called A Just and Lasting Peace that I use. A bunch of primary sources about Reconstruction. And his report's in there. It's much longer than what I've shared with you. And then so we can corroborate those things. And the students found some things that refuted that. Establish a plausible narrative. I'm going to do that in just a minute, and then we'll summarize our thoughts. So I'm going to appeal to Labov's narrative. Labov was a guy in the 1970s who went around and watched people old men telling stories around, the bars, around like fishing stories. And you realize that all good stories have, yep, that's right. That Mark Schertz, yep. The Civil Rights Act Agency, that report found very similar things to what Schertz did. I just chose two things. I could have very easily used that. So thank you, Mark. He said that every story starts with abstract. What the story's about. Hey man, I caught a fish yesterday. Second thing is orientation. Who, when, where, and what. Then there's some complicating action. Then what happened? It throws a wrench in it. All right. I was fishing and then something happened. My boat broke down. Then evaluation. So what? Why is this important? Then there's a resolution, and then we got to link it back to the present. So why is this important? And a lot of times we ask students to write narratives, but we don't have them write good narratives. And so I figured Labov is an expert in storytelling, so we'll just use his ideas on how to write stories. And so here's my Reconstruction story, and I'm a little bit run out of time, so I'm gonna hurry up. So the abstract is that it's happening during Reconstruction. White Southern attempts to maintain a power structure, and Nast is highlighting injustice. If Nast is telling the story. And then orientation, it's 4 years after the America after 4 years of war. A victorious North has prevented Southern secession, and it's after the slavery is ended. Complicating action, what happens? Efforts by white Southerners to maintain some form of pre-war power structure. We saw that in the image and with our eyewitnesses. The black codes were enacted in the South, including corporal punishment and selling of freedmen. All right, evaluation. Why it's important. The narrative by Nast, expanded by the teacher, me, through various sources, demonstrates the need for a shift from presidential Reconstruction to radical Reconstruction. And I've got on the far right where the sources of that. I just don't have time to go over it. And then evaluation, and then result, Johnson was impeached. Congress became more radical and enacted radical Reconstruction. There's about 10 more years of Reconstruction that was successful in creating a formal legal structure to integrate freedmen into national society, but ultimately it failed in true integration and formed enslaved people into national fabric. The teacher has to bring in the result from this resolution after the students have done this, done the heavy lifting of an analysis. The teacher has to bring in, it's kind of the rest of the story, it's a Paul Harvey part. And then the coda, the link to the present. Our nation continued to struggle with full integration of all citizens, as C. Van Woodward wrote in the 1960s. And I deliberately chose a 1960 guy who said, after making a few token payments during Reconstruction, the United States defaulted on the debt, a term used by Martin Luther King, oddly enough, and unilaterally declared a moratorium that lasted 8 decades. That debt was further augmented by the shabby treatment of the forgotten creditors, our own Negro citizens. And so why it's important. And I think we can still say some of that's true today. And so we go and say, hey, another way, I kind of broke it down here and you can look at it. I just read through this. I just got rid of where it came from. And then if we were to have the students write it, well, this would be me as a teacher writing, because I think different people can tell the stories. Maybe this is the teacher's story, or what I think Nass's story is. The story is about Reconstruction. Nass illustrates efforts made by white Southerners to maintain the pre-war structure that kept Black Americans in the subservient position in society. Then less than 2 years after, this is less than 2 years after 4 years of brutal civil war, in which the North was victorious and prevented the Southern states from seceding and ending slavery, but the South did not stop fighting. They shifted their efforts to reestablish a new power structure based on Black codes to control Black lives. Nash cartoon and other sources illustrate the need in 1867 to shift from presidential Reconstruction to radical Reconstruction. In the end, President Johnson's political power is broken and Congress enacts radical Reconstruction, would last for about 10 years. This radical Reconstruction is successful in creating the formal legal structure for integration of freedmen into American society, but ultimately fails to integrate. In fact, this is important because we still deal with the results of this failure. And I think that's important to bring that today. Our nation struggles with the full integration of all the citizens, as C. Van Woodward wrote 60 years ago. After making a few token payments during Reconstruction, the United States defaulted on the debt and unilaterally declared a moratorium that lasted 8 decades. Now, that's my interpretation of Nass, but maybe when our students write one, well, theirs isn't going to be as sophisticated as mine is. I'm almost 50 years old. Maybe theirs would be something like this. This is their plausible narrative that they would get from this. After the Civil War, Southern states enacted Black codes that include selling Black men into slavery and corporal punishment for crimes. So very simple. Thomas Nass illustrated these crimes and showed the need for stronger Reconstruction. Radical Reconstruction, Republicans in Congress responded with radical Reconstruction. And I believe we went through the sources thing once, and then we did a deep dive like we did the thing link, the average, 8th grader can write something like this, at least one kind of Mississippi. So I think that most of us can get something like this out of our students. If we do that, I think we're getting a pretty good narrative. And then they're kind of constructing and owning the history. Of course, about this object, I love this, and no one tell anybody at the Library of Congress, but no one's perfect. The Library of Congress, whoever wrote it up, what's going on with this and the description of this, they say, this is what they say is happening. They say 2 illustrations showing enslaved men being punished for a crime before Emancipation Proclamation and an African man being whipped as a crime in 1866. They actually got it wrong. But I love this because whenever I use this source with students, you know what happens? It's so empowering because they can say, you know what? The Library of Congress got it wrong and we got it right. Just by going through this analysis process, and how empowering for that, for a student is that they can get it right when these other students, when the Library of Congress has gotten it wrong. So anyway, so I'm gonna summarize final thoughts. These are questions for you, so you can ask questions. You don't have much time, I apologize. But what questions do you still have? What else do you want to know? And what additional sources do you need? And I can tell you that you're free to use my stuff any way you want to. What question do you have? No questions. All right, Stephen says no questions. Anyone else, any questions about the source, other sources that we could use? I've used this to teach Reconstruction in 7th and 8th grade. I wouldn't recommend it much lower than that because the graphic violence. I do believe in some age appropriateness, but I think 7th and 8th grade U.S. history or high school is a good one to use it on. I will show you if you go to the website. Thank you for Christopher. If you go to the website, I've got all the references with links, and then below it, I've got teacher resources that provides a corroboration and the contextualization. So I think it was Mark said, hey, just rely on one source. We don't have to. And so I have the Carl Schurz quotes there and the citations for you. If you're a citation, you don't want to be plagiarizing. You got John Roy Lynch's quotes from his book. So you don't have to go buy the book. Got some links to the Civil Rights Bill, some information about the Civil Rights Bill, 14th Amendment. So I got the resources there. Please feel free to use them. But I'm gonna stop sharing and I'm gonna pass it back, I guess.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
Can you hear me? Oh, okay. So how do you integrate? Okay, so we've been looking at a visual,
Yep.
Which makes it a little easier. Have you done this with written text where that's the primary source that they're looking at? And
yeah, I do. Yeah, I think it's easier to use an image first. I've noticed that people don't like to read, but yeah, I've used it. I used to use a source, a set of letters between Abraham Lincoln and I cannot remember the young lady's name, where she told me they looked ugly and needed to wear the beard and stuff like that. I started with that source to introduce Lincoln, to make him look human, and then I contextualized it with a map of she was from somewhere up around Buffalo, New York. He was in Springfield. It only takes 3 days for the letter to get there. And we talk about, wow, man, have you mailed a letter lately? And we bring in, she talks about the campaign literature. And so I end up bringing in examples of Lincoln's campaign literature. So I do the same thing with going from that, Grace Bedell, that letter between Grace Bedell and Lincoln. And I'm able to do that. And I even throw a joke about, because Lincoln says he didn't have any daughters, but he has 3 sons. And I say, yeah, and one of them died from a vampire, there when he was in the White House. If you're familiar with that, and of course, people that have watched that movie laugh, the Vampire Killer movie. But yeah, it goes both ways. I really like to start with images though, but I have done it with a text.
Well,
Yeah.
History Alive, the TCI people, they always like to use images. But the next question is, so when you want the kids to get the background and you're in the classroom, this is working with a teacher, do you let the kids then go and look at these books? Because I mean, you're talking about reading whole books. So
Nope.
You stop the discussion. How do you integrate that if that's where they're going to get?
I bring so what I do is some of the stuff, if it's a short thing, I'll give it to them. But I'm not giving this to them. I'm doing the heavy lifting and doing the excerpt. So I'd give them a printed out excerpt of a paragraph from Carl Schurz in this, or a paragraph from Lynch in this. They only need about a paragraph of Lynch saying, yeah, I remember they were passing these black codes. He didn't call them black codes in his book, but that's what he's talking about. So I would just simply use that. Now, a children's book, yeah, I'd read a children's book to them in a heartbeat to do that. But I wouldn't do it with, I wouldn't give them this book, no. Maybe a graduate student I would, but I wouldn't give that to the average 8th grader.
So because we're running out of time, so Mark, hang on 1 second, please. So because we're running out of time, we only have 1 minute. I'm going to ask for Dr. Waring to say, a few quick final words. And then everyone that's still here, I'll go ahead and I'll share the code so that you can get your continuing education credits. And then Mark, I'm sure you have a question. And then what I'll do is I'll put Dr. Anthony's email address in the chat box so that you'll be able to continue afterward, because we're right at 5 and I know we have some closing thoughts. So Dr. Waring.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Anthony. I really enjoyed your presentation. I know we all did, and we benefited. And so thank you for being a part of this today. And I'll wrap up once again, thanking everybody else for participating and being here and everything that you do in the classroom. A couple of the resources you see in front of you on that web address at that Weebly. I do work with a colleague with emerging technologies and instructional design. So here are some great emerging Web 2.0 resources for you that are related to some of those stages. And then also those of you who know me know I am very passionate about the Sources Annual Conference. So there is a link there. I am accepting proposals right now. So if you have any questions about it or you want to register for the conference, it is completely free. And I have to say it's a phenomenal event because I don't present, and all the presenters who come do an amazing job. Dr. Anthony hopefully will be there with some of his colleagues. And as Chris said, we'll definitely stick around. So if you have questions, thoughts for me or for Kenny, or feel free to email either of us. We definitely welcome that as well. But thank you all once again. And I'll turn over to Chris for one last thought.
So just, when you guys are logged into Event Owl, and that's the platform you use to access the Zoom session, on Dr. Anthony's agenda page, on the right-hand side, you'll see under the agenda details, the checkout link. Click it, a window will open. And at the bottom will be a text box, and in it you will enter the code Web3, and I've put that in the chat box, and this will unlock the survey and auto-generate a continuing education certificate that you can use towards recertification. To access that certificate, hover over your name in Event Owl. A drop-down menu will appear, and the third line item will be that certificate. You click it, and a PDF will pop. So I can't thank you all enough for joining us. We really appreciate it. This was a great presentation to cap off this particular webinar series, but we will be doing these monthly, so we look forward to the next one. And I know that Drs. Waring and Anthony will be hanging on. So Mark, if you want to continue with your last question for Dr. Anthony, hang on, but everybody else, thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you all so much.
I have a final question.
Okay. Steve, you want to stop
Now-
recording?